In 1954, renowned English composer Malcolm Arnold composed Concerto for Harmonica, a 10-minute long work for what we see is a rather unusual instrument. Born in October 1921, Arnold was surrounded by music growing up, with two concert pianists for parents and a grandfather who was choir master at the Chapel Royal in the United Kingdom. Dedicated and debuted to and by world-class harmonica player Larry Adler, this concerto has found its way to the top of the list of standard repertoire for this instrument. Made up of three different movements, grazioso, mesto, and con brio, this work premiered at the Royal Albert Hall on August 14th, 1954 with the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Now, although written for Adler, today we're going to look at a performance by Tommy Riley. Riley grew up as a violinist with some training in harmonica too. Like Arnold, he grew up in a musical family. Originally from Canada, he moved with his family to London in 1935. At the start of World War II, he began to study music at Leipzig University. While there, he was arrested and interned in a prisoner of war camp for 5 years and 8 months. Let's take a listen to what he has to say about this experience himself in an interview with Paul Jones.
Now, while you were at Leipzig, something pretty vile happened to you. You were arrested by the Gestapo.
It sounds terrible, doesn't it? Yeah.
It still sounds as if you've done something wrong, doesn't it?
No, well,
but why?
Well, I was a foreigner, you know, and there's people who didn't understand the totalitarian government, which was at that time in Germany. They didn't understand. If you were arrested, you tell people today, say, we must have done something. You didn't have to do anything in those days. It was like Al Capone running the...
You were an alien and therefore undesirable.
Exactly.
So, but you spent the entire war in various prisoner war camps?
Yeah, I was in different camps for 5 years, 8 months. People say, oh, that's 5 years, 8 months out of your life. It isn't. It's 5 years, 8 months part of your life. I learned a lot in there.
Including learning something about the harmonica.
I learned a lot. I did play, as I said before, I played before, but I had... Conditions weren't good, to put it mildly, but at least we had the time. And I learned a lot about the instrument. I had time to study the instrument, what made it work, and basic movements and everything.
But they wear out, don't they? How did you go on for supplies?
Well, I did a little bit of business with a German welfare officer who was a Canadian German, and I gave him a half a pound of coffee out of Canadian Red Cross parcel. And I'm not kidding, you could buy a hotel with that in Germany at that time. And he got harmonica, 24 chromatic harmonicas from the factory in Germany and gave them. They would have sent them to me, but with the political situation as it was at that time, they daren't send them to me. So he got them in his name and gave them to me.
Let's first take a look at how the harmonica works. So this is a Hohner harmonica. It's a chromatic harmonica which Riley performed on throughout his career. Now, how does it work? Before this, I had no idea how a harmonica worked, but I had an assumption that you blew into it. So in the most basic terms, sound is produced on a harmonica by either inhaling or exhaling into it. They call this blowing or drawing. The left side has lower notes, and as you move to the right, pitches go up, sort of like a piano. Now this is a diagram of the insides. So the top cover and the bottom cover hold everything together, just like a hamburger bun. On both of these reed plates, the blow reeds and the draw reeds, face downwards. They're attached to the comb, and blowing or drawing air passes through the chamber, which causes these reeds to vibrate and produces sound. When you blow into it, the blow reeds vibrate. When you draw from it, draw reeds vibrate. But like any other instrument, the more practice you put in, the more familiar it becomes to you. As musicians, we can't help but put labels on a lot of things, specifically instruments, trying to classify them into groups. And if I had $1 for every time I heard the piano as a percussion or string instrument debate, I would have my own engraved Steinway, and I could tip them very well for delivering it. But what about the harmonica? Clearly wind, since there's the element of blowing into it that makes a resonant sound. But is it brass or woodwind? So it's actually a woodwind, but it's more specifically a free reed instrument, which I had not heard of. This means that there are brass reeds inside, but only attached on one end. So putting air into the harmonica will in turn make these reeds vibrate. And what's really unique about this is that blowing into the harmonica produces a different sound versus drawing it. All right, so check this out. In order to get all the pitches out on the chromatic harmonica, Tommy Riley utilizes blowing and drawing. But the chromatic harmonica also has another function to aid. Notice here, there's a button on the side. When you push it in, it raises every corresponding pitch by a half step respectively, shown here in this chart. Okay, enough anatomy, because this isn't science, after all. Let's look at how a chord can be played on the harmonica. So in this concerto, from measures 69 to 72, Riley plays this ascending chordal figure up by half steps. Starting in 69, he blows into the 5 through 9 holes to get that C, E, G, C triad action. Then in the next measure, he presses the button in to go up to the D flat major, still blowing air through the same holes. Following that in 71, he pushes the button back out and draws air from the instrument, same tone holes, to get this new chord. And then continuing with this in measure 72, still drawing air through, going up yet again chromatically to the E flat minor add 6. And this gesture continues. It happens again from measure 75 to about measure 80. When you look at it, measure 75, there's that C major. Next measure, 76, there's that D flat major. But when we get to measure 77, although it's the same pitches, it's organized in a different way. And we actually have a B half diminished 7. Following that, measure 78, instead of that E flat minor add 6, based off the positioning and the orientation of the notes again, we have a C diminished 7. Now I know what you're thinking. You desperately want to know what this looks like on the chromatic harmonica chart. Don't worry. Don't worry. So here we have measure 75, that lovely C major triad, right? Blowing in through tone holes 9 through 12, get that C triad. Same thing, button in, blowing in through 9 through 12 to get that D flat major. That's in 76. 77, we're drawing from tone holes 8 to 11, right? And that forms our B half diminished 7 chord. Same thing, now button in, tone holes 8 through 11, measure 78 through 80, we get that C fully diminished 7. All right, since you've waited so patiently through all this arithmetic and anatomy, let's take a listen to this whole section. Okay, so enough about the harmonica as an instrument. Let's take a look at some orchestration. So this concerto features a relatively specialized orchestration. It's got a full string section and a brass section, plus timpani, snare, bass drum, cymbal, and wood block. The brass section runs with 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 2 tenor trombones, and a bass trombone, and 1 tuba. Now in this first movement, it's quite a playful nature. It's a back and forth between the harmonica and orchestra, and that brings in some calm response that we see throughout. The brass tend to be more bold in their entrances and the strings more reserved, business as usual, another day at the office. Throughout this piece, you can typically hear the strings playing pizzicato, and this sort of has a jazz-like effect, especially in the bass. So let's take a listen to this right from the start. And notice how the bass is outlining that C major chord right as it starts in the beginning. And then it continues outlining the following chords, right? We got that E major 7, heading back to the C7, and then F sharp 7. And then this continues as this whole melodic theme happens in the harmonica. Bass is always going to be accompanying this with this walking pattern. we hear that harmonica melody, there's always that French horn 4/8 note gesture happening as a response. There's a 3-measure gesture by the harmonica with that call, and the response comes with the French horn. French horn's always playing 4/8 notes on concert A flat, right? So if we look at measure 7, right as that first 3-bar gesture finishes on the harmonica's D, in the French horn, we have an A flat, which is actually forming a tritone. And then if we look another 3 bars later, in measure 10, instead of having that tritone now, the harmonica ends on an F sharp, and we form a major second. Now looking again at measure 13, we see once again the tritone is formed between the horn and the harmonica. And we're obviously expecting another major second, but instead what we get at the end in measure 16 is we get a minor third between an F natural and the A flat. So no F sharp, F natural. Let's take a listen to that and see if we could pick that out. So another thing worth mentioning about what we listen to, both in the bass and the French horn, every time that bass walking pattern comes in on beat 2 of that C7. So looking at measure 5, comes in on beat 2, and then when it repeats again in 8, it's on beat 2. Same thing with the horn. Every time the horn comes in with that 8th note interjection as a response, comes in on beat 2. So what does it all mean? What the beat 2, is there some sort of beat 2 conspiracy going on? No, it's not a conspiracy. I just find it interesting how Arnold uses these orchestration tools as well as call and response to further embellish this melody in the harmonica. And it creates sort of a conversation going on between the performer and the soloist instrument with Tommy Riley and the whole orchestra. This section from rehearsal letter D to E is pretty contrasting, as it operates mostly in D major with some accompaniment. The harmonica has these instances of utilizing the achromatic scale, seen right on measure 48. The harmonica has this gesture, which is the call, and the response comes from the violins, measure right after 49. Then it goes back and forth with this call and response gesture all the way until rehearsal E. When we approach measure 54, there's a bit of sparseness throughout the ensemble during this. After an intense section with fortissimo dynamics and heavy accents and articulations, it starts to begin to wind down. Now, some of that space is filled primarily with percussive instruments. The hero of the woodblock and the snare drum come in measure 54 and 55. This helps us touch down nicely into rehearsal letter E. Now, before we get into that, let's take a look at what some of the other instruments are doing to help fill this space. One of the common occurrences we see in the brass section is how they build their chords inside of their respective instruments. So let's take a look at measure 54 first with the horns, right? We notice that there's this staggered entrance of 1, 2, 3, and 4, where we're forming this D minor 7, right? So if we look, there's the first note, which is that flat 7, concert C in horn 1. On beat 3, we get an A from horn 3. Downbeat of 55 gives us that F natural in the second horn. And finally, for our root, we get horn 4 on beat 2. Now, if we continue in measure 55, we see this transfers over to the trombone and tuba. Similar pattern, but this time on a G minor 7 chord. So we're checking off orchestration here, but also there's an element of call and response in between this, even if it's just stacking chords. The only difference that we notice here between the trombones and tuba versus the horns is that the horns have a staggered entrance, but the trombones and tuba all come in on beat 3 of 55 with that chord. Continuing on at rehearsal E, we see for the first and only time that another instrument has the melody, and it's not one that you would expect. Major shout out to viola players, but the viola actually inherits the melodic theme that the harmonica has so graciously outlined for us. And the harmonica still remains in the forefront, but in tandem with the viola as it has its own counter melody. This starts right at rehearsal letter E, and while this occurs, all the other string instruments adopt a pizzicato bass-like feel that we saw in the opening in order to support this melody. So as the harmonica transfers the duties of the melody and the call to the violas, the horns relinquish their response to the trumpets. Still playing on a concert A flat, the trumpets play this exact same gesture muted to emulate the sound of the horn. And when we usually see that harmonica melody, we get that horn tritone and major second response with the call. It can be difficult to notice this swap without the score in front of you. I did not notice it through first listen. Try to see if you can pick that out when we listen to this whole section. And as they say, history tends to repeat itself, and we draw back on yet another element of the past here with those horns building their chords together. In measure 57, we have a G minor 7. 58, we move to an E7. Back on the G minor 7 in 59, a short insert of a G flat add 6 in 61. G minor 7, 62. One last time on that E7 in 64 before we end this section on the home chord of G minor 7. With all of that in mind, let's follow along with it with the recording and the score, starting at rehearsal letter D. Okay, let's take 5 and digest what we just spent some time discussing. So far, we've covered the harmonica's capabilities as an instrument and saw those chordal sections it builds throughout measures 69 to 78. Then we delved into some orchestration talk throughout this piece. I'm wondering, based on our listening so far, is it odd to you that there are no woodwinds in this? I find something to be lacking as a woodwind player myself, but I feel a similarity in this piece with like Mahler 5 or Bruckner 9, which calls upon these super heavy brass sections. That's sort of soar above. We also discussed some moments of call and response here as well, most notably with the French horns and the trumpet with that 8th note motif. Now, it's time to move on to something of my creation. Okay, so here's the listening map I made. This follows along the movement, and it includes most of what we talked about already. I'm sorry I don't have any more corkboard and red string. The neighbors made too many phone calls, and apparently it was making them uncomfortable. But if that's what helps you learn best and you have the wall space, then go right ahead. Okay, so we're going to cover orchestration. We have this key in the bottom left. From any section I wrote down, I wanted to see what was most prominent. This foreground in green, and the middle ground's in purple, and the underlying things in the background are orange, which is usually accompaniment. I've organized it in a way where green's at the top, as this is what sticks out the most. So this is typically the harmonica melody or those ascending chords it has at measure 69. Purple's right below it. This is usually what is supporting green the most, but it also has its moments where it creeps into the limelight. An example of this is that famous French horn eighth note motif. It sort of peaks in on those times that the harmonica is diminuendoing. Orange tends to be below the chart. This is what forms our foundation. It's the bottom of the pyramid. So this is that bass walking gesture, those random trombone glissandos scattered throughout, or those strings playing pizzicato. On the next line, I've also added measure numbers so you can follow along and see where those main things are happening, both in the responses I've already discussed, but also just to make sense of what's going on here. If you notice, you'll see these rehearsal letters, right? Measure 5, you see rehearsal A, 25, A prime, B. This is not to be confused with those rehearsal letters. This is rather discussing form. So that first 5 measures is just an intro. But once we get that main melody from the harmonica, that's when our A section begins. It's the first time we hear the melody, call that A. And it happens again in 25. So it's A prime, repeats. 38 is when we get our first different thing with the harmonica. It's playing this descending figure and ascending figure. And it outlines these triads. And after that, 48, we get to see that's where that achromatic section is. And this continues throughout the rest of this chart. Now, on the line, I also indicated where those tritone and major second figures happen, including another key next to the orchestra one down at the bottom. Notice the pattern that occurs with this. It's tritone, second, tritone, and then sometimes we get that major third, sometimes we get a unison with the whole orchestra, like at measure 36. And although we haven't gone in depth on everything on this chart, you can use everything that we've already talked about as a way to decipher this. Some other notable things that stuck out to me was that the harmonica plays the melody again towards the end in measure 99. But this is the first time that the melody is played in a different octave, and it's one below the usual. The tone and vibrato Riley gets in this register is super rich. Let's take a listen. Another interesting thing that happens right after this in 104, what we expect to get is that A flat action in the horns. Horns 1 and 2 have an A flat, but horns 3 and 4 have an A natural. So we have some half step clashing. The first time I heard this, or actually when I saw it on the score, I figured there was an error. But then I looked a little bit ahead. And if you follow along with me, 3 after J, if you look at the viola and cello part, there's a D flat. But if you look at the bass, there's a D natural. And then this section's in B flat Dorian, right? The last 4 after J, the bass has that B flat. But the violin 2 starts this ascending B flat Dorian triadic motive on a B natural. So I think it's safe to assume, I'm not sure what Malcolm Arnold's doing, but it definitely adds this complex layer of crunch right before we get to this super open ending where the harmonica plays this last melodic gesture, this time up the octave. Let's take a listen to that. I love the addition of the Glock with that counter melody in measure 115. I find it compelling how we haven't heard it throughout this piece at all, but when the harmonica goes up to the top of its register, it sort of adds this ethereal feel to it. Now notice too in measure 126, the cello plays that eighth note gesture on that concert A flat. Malcolm Arnold, rather weird at times, composed a magnificent piece of music, and I'd be lying if I said I was not skeptical when I first heard this piece. Testament to his compositional skills, this piece in its entirety serves as a wonderful addition to the 20th century compositions and harmonica repertoire. When we refer to someone as excelling at something, a compliment we often give them is that they have range. In music, range is an element that we use to describe pitch and capabilities of an instrument. But as a performer, Tommy Riley has some outstanding range. Here he is playing the same melody as the movement comes to an end, and hear how he spans over 3 octaves of the harmonica and graciously fades away into the ether like a curling rock headed to the center of the house. Now to sum it all up, I'll leave you with a few thoughts of my own on this work. And I think as musicians, we get stuck playing and more so listening to the classics. We tend to not venture into the depths of the unknown. Now, this is not a major call for orchestras everywhere to program harmonica and banjo concertos, but I'm encouraging you to expand your listening and search for the music that's out there. Music, like language, unfortunately can go extinct, and already throughout history, there's been a lot of pieces that have disappeared. I know when you think of it, the harmonica is associated with the Western anti-hero who gets thrown in jail and pulls this out to show that they are feeling emotional about it, character development or whatever. Or if you're a pop music fan and you're from New York, you think of Billy Joel or Stevie Wonder. But remember, beautiful music can come from anywhere, sometimes the most unlikely places. Until next time.